Hello and welcome to this Personnel Today webinar brought to you in association with Questback. I'm Rob Moss, editor of Personnel Today, and today we're looking at the future of employee research. How do you measure the opinions of your staff? And what do you do with the results of those surveys? How can better insight be used to implement effective change? These questions and more will be covered over the next hour as we hear from 3 expert guests with a wealth of experience in this area. My first guest is Andrew Cox. He's Managing Director of Conflux, and until 2012 he was the former Head of Engagement and Employer Brand at HSBC, the bank. He now provides consultancy services in this area. He's an assessment psychologist with over 15 years experience in employee engagement, culture and change, and he led the European employee engagement practice at Watson Wyatt before moving to HSBC. Paul Barnes is our second guest. It's UK Managing Director of Questback. Paul has been at the forefront of innovation in customer experience sector since 2000, and he established the UK business of Eptica, a leading customer service software provider. He's been involved in numerous large customer experience transformations, and he joined Questback in 2013 to lead the next phase of its expansion in the UK. And finally, Luke Talbot is Senior Product Manager at Questback, an agile feedback management platform that helps organizations increase employee engagement. He's over 12 years experience in software production in telecoms and mobility industries. Okay, so that's our 3 guests. Before I begin, I'll briefly outline the format for today. We essentially split the webinar into 2 with presentations for the first 30 to 40 minutes, and then we have a Q&A session which will run until we finish at about 3 o'clock. As we go, we're keen to get your questions and any queries you have on what our presenters are saying. Feel free to submit these at any time in the chat pane in the left-hand side of your screen. I'll keep an eye on the questions coming in, but unless I feel that anything is particularly pressing, then we'll save those up for the Q&A. We are recording the webinar, and an on-demand version will become available next week, along with the PowerPoint slides and a transcript of today's presentations and discussion. You'll find the on-demand version and an archive of webinars at personneltoday.com/webinars. Okay, we begin by welcoming Andrew Cox. Over to you, Andrew.
Thanks very much, Rob. As Rob mentioned, if my maths is correct, I've been involved in employee research since the late 1990s. So I've seen the rise of employee engagement and the sort of acceptance in business terms that it's a very important thing to be measuring and managing. And also I've seen a measurement model being adopted very widely, mostly sort of driven by the HR consultancies. These tend to be based on a proprietary model of engagement and an employee engagement index metric, supported by external benchmarks and historical comparisons. And the orthodoxy was that if we drive engagement across organizations, there will be concomitant improvements in business performance and financial results and the like. I have a lot of conversations with people involved in employee engagement and more widely in the business context. And I think recently, over the last year or 2, there's been quite a change in the way people see how they collect and manage employee engagement metrics. And I think it's fair to say that there's increased dissatisfaction with the status quo. I think there's a feeling generally that there is a better way and a general sort of questioning as to why people are doing what they're doing and can it be improved. And often during these conversations, I ask the question, if you were to take a blank sheet of paper and design, without regard for what you're doing now, and design a process whereby you collect and manage employee engagement data and do employee research more generally, what would it look like? And in almost 100% of cases, it does not match up with what the current practice is. And as a sort of supplemental question to that, if I ask, given where you are now, where would you like or expect to be in 5 years' time in terms of how you're measuring and managing employee research programs? And again, you don't get the response that we don't want or expect anything to change. There is a real desire for things to move forward. This is coming quite clearly from HR and internal comms and from the business itself, and I think it's fair to say that the HR consultancies have been pretty slow to respond to these kind of messages. I think there are various reasons for this. I think, there's a certain element of perhaps they don't know how, or perhaps they don't have the tools to support the changes that are required. But also I think there's an element of they quite like it how it is. The business model is that they have their proprietary models, they have they've built up their benchmarks, and they know how to do what they do. During this session, what I hope to do is to give you some ideas about how you might be able to sort of break free from the established orthodoxy. And this is something which is largely, but not exclusively, enabled by technology. But hopefully we can show you what's possible and help you develop a view of how you can regain control over what you're doing and help you to plan on an ongoing basis how you're going to move the process forward and make it more sophisticated and aligned to your business needs. Before I do that and go on more generally, there's a polling question here which I'd like you to consider. This is assuming that you are conducting employee research. I'd just like you to think about how your survey content is determined in terms of the questions that you ask in the survey itself. Now, I know that probably more than one of these responses could apply, but which one mostly determines the content of your survey? Historical trends or external, when it says external targets, what I mean there is I'm not quite sure what that means. Anyway, a third-party standardized model of employee engagement, which is a prescriptive one, usually coming from an HR consultancy. Emerging issues as they happen, so do you have the flexibility to tailor your content to things as they arise in terms of importance? Or is the content based purely upon your individual strategy and priority? So independent of what other people are asking, but purely aligned with what's important to you. And we'll come back to that and look at some of the results as they're coming in a little bit later. So I talked about a certain amount of dissatisfaction with the current status quo. And the next obvious question is, where is this dissatisfaction coming from? And for me, this slide illustrates this quite well. And I think the answer to the question is largely, not entirely, but largely this dissatisfaction is coming from the top. This is a summary of the findings of a survey conducted by the Financial Times last year of over 1,000 business leaders. And it asked them what were the major challenges facing you as a business leader, and then some more detail on some of the issues that arose. As you can see here, the feedback from the business leaders was that human capital presented the biggest challenge to them that they faced. And moving down into the second part, that breaks down some of the leading human capital issues. And second in that list there is the need to raise employee engagement. Now this is a very good thing to see. Presumably most of the people on the call have a professional interest in employee engagement, and obviously to see this up there in terms of priority for business leaders is a very healthy thing to see. But for me this illustrates an issue. What are we engaging people for? What does it mean? And why are we doing it? And I think the answer to that question is contained within the other priority areas that are listed on this slide. So we're talking about development, we're talking about retention of talent, we're talking about improving how the organization is viewed so that we can increase the attraction and retention of the right kind of talent. And similarly, looking above at the other priorities there, I think 3 of the other ones, innovation, customer relationships, and operational excellence, are very pertinent here. What I mean by this is that we are engaging people for a purpose, and the purpose is to help them to drive strategic organizational outcomes. It doesn't exist in isolation. It exists in terms of its importance to outcomes. Looking at the human capital breakdown there, improving leadership development programs, engaging leadership was identified from the Engage for Success initiative as being one of the key things. So increasing leaders' awareness of how they engage people and how they create a dialogue with their people is clearly very important. Looking at the bottom part there, improve corporate brand and employee value propositions to attract talent. That essentially is talking about engaging people before they even join the organization. And I think what's important to bear in mind here is we need to look at how engagement affects people who haven't joined, who have joined, or who have even left. In my role at HSBC, when I first joined HSBC, as well as the global employee survey that was conducted, there was an absolute myriad of other data collection initiatives around candidate experience, around retention, and as people left the organization, the impact of training. There were internal communication surveys, there were internal customer surveys. All of these were happening in isolation. They were not joined up either in terms of what was covered, the technology that was used, or how all of these different factors interacted. So one change that HSBC has made with the help of Questback is to start bringing all of those different initiatives together so that they speak to one another. So that as an organization you can understand what it is which is impacting your top talent's decision to leave an organization or to stay with an organization. And there, one of the issues there is increased efforts to retain critical talent. I know that intention to stay is a key measure of almost all models of employee engagement, but take that to its logical conclusion, we don't want to retain everybody. We want to retain our best people. We want to retain our high performers and the people who have the skills and the talents that we need. Now, in order to understand the impact on them rather than everybody generally, we need to link our employee engagement data to our HR data, so we can tell who those people are and what differentiates them in terms of their decisions to stay or leave with an organization. And expanding that further, we ideally need a platform which can allow us to look at the employee journey throughout the employee life cycle, from when they join right through even after they leave the organization, for example, through alumni surveys. The second issue here is looking at above the line there in terms of the major priorities. We've got innovation, customer relationships, and operational excellence. The issue here is innovation is largely driven by our employees. The question here is how can we harness employee ideas and insights into how we can do things better, and that applies to products and services as well as operations. How can we streamline what we're doing? Because obviously they're at the coalface, they have as good an understanding, if not a better one, than anyone else. So how can we develop those kinds of ongoing dialogues which involve people in the improvements that we need to make? Similarly with customer relationships, how can we use employee input to improve the quality of those, as well as how can we empirically look at the linkages between customer outcomes and our employees? How much do our employees understand what the priorities of our customers are, and how can we involve them in the process of improvement? So for me, there are 3 key ways that you can look at an employee engagement strategy. First of all, gather the data, the empirical data, which allows us to look at the relationships between these important areas. Secondly, how can we develop an ongoing dialogue within and between our people? because this is the way that will drive real cultural behavioral change, which changes the dynamic about how our employees relate to each other and the company. And thirdly, how can we use this to develop our organization, our leadership and management skills, identify best practice in terms of what people are doing and how, propagate that, and also involve our individuals. The other area here is how can we integrate the feedback, so to take it beyond just giving generalized feedback on employee engagement, but how can we help people to make the connections and join the dots in a way between employee engagement and those business outcomes. Now, it's a truism to say that the pace of change is increasing rapidly and change is the new normal. Is what we're doing in terms of engaging our employees keeping up with this rate of change? I'll just give you a brief anecdote. Just recently I was in conversation with a large international financial services firm, and as part of that conversation I was given sight of their current an employee survey report for part of their business. Now, it just so happened that about 10 years ago, in the mid-noughties, I managed the global program for that organization. And I was quite surprised to see that of all of the items on the survey, only 2 had changed in those 10 years. Now, given that they were a financial sector organization, and given the amount of change that's happened in that sector over the last 10 years, following the banking crisis, the scandals over PPI and other customer service issues that they've faced, the importance of social responsibility and risk management, it was quite enlightening, but a little bit worrying to see that that had not been reflected in any way in terms of what they were gathering from their employee survey. This is an extreme example, but I think it's illustrative of the pace of change, perhaps when we're thinking about employee engagement, and the way we deal with it is fairly glacial compared to the pace of change more generally in the business environment. Another area here is the responsiveness of the tools that we use to gather data. Clearly, the pace of change dictates that we conduct surveys more regularly than once a year. Some organizations, of course, employ pulse surveys to sort of plug the gaps and increase the frequency. The problem here is that they generally use a subset of the overall survey questions. And this is in no way a substitute for developing an ongoing dialogue in real time. So we need a system which is responsive enough to deal with issues as they arise, much more in the mode of a customer survey, which is event-driven, and allows us to design a questionnaire, get the feedback, process it, feed it back to the business in a timescale that allows us to do something about it before it's too late. And obviously, I think the annual survey, and certainly even if it's supplemented by pulse surveys, does not give us the ability to do that. So, to summarize, we need something more agile and reactive, much more strategic in terms of driven by business priorities. The cycles need to be shorter. Recent research was published to suggest that millennials expect to have the opportunity to give feedback 3 or 4 times a week as a minimum. So clearly giving them the opportunity once a year in a formal process is not going to be enough. And in that final point there, it is not enough to go forward just with a quantitative data collection process. We need something which has much more of a transformative effect in and of itself. If we encourage a culture of ongoing feedback in an open way, that's going to have numerous transformational benefits that take us beyond what is delivered just by an annual cycle. Maybe we can go back to the original question before I pass over. Okay, and here we see that the priorities, the business strategy and priorities are by far the biggest factor determining the content of the surveys, and that's a very, very good thing to see. But again, quite a reliance on third-party external models and benchmarks.
I think that's interesting, Andrew, because you've got 46%, 45%, something like that, that's really dependent on external factors, compliance with third-party standard models or external benchmarks or something like that. So it's a good indication of some of the things you were saying.
Yeah.
Good. So I think that was pretty much the end of your bit, Andrew. And
there's just one more slide. I think it's not sufficient.
There we are. I'll let you have your last slide. You need to go. Yeah. Okay.
There we go. So the upshot of all that is that the standard model that's been in existence for 15 years or more no longer really supplies all of this that we need. And the question is, do the systems exist from a technical perspective and from a practical perspective to support a new model? And the answer is absolutely yes. Some organizations have embarked on this journey already. But if anything else, I would encourage everybody to break from the established orthodoxy, the established ways of thinking about things, to ask those what on the face of it might appear like basic fundamental questions. And I think when you start doing that, you will develop an appetite for changing how you do what you do.
Good. So I think that takes it on to my section, and I'm going to really talk about some of the approaches that we've seen with Questback working with a number of our customers over recent years, and working with some of the innovators around employee engagement. We're fortunate enough to work with lots of them, from travel sector companies like Lufthansa through retailers like Sainsbury's and banks like HSBC and insurers like RSA, some of the people who are really starting to push this. Just as a question that, again, we might loop back to later, you can see on the screen there, it's really a slightly philosophical question, really, about whether engagement is something that's a process or a culture, and I think it's something we'll come back to later. But I want to start really by saying, there is good news here. As we want to address this, the great foundation, the real positive thing is people want to talk. It's really different if you look compared to today, compared to even 4 or 5 years ago. We live in a sharing economy. I would be absolutely stunned if we haven't got 100% of the people on the call today who don't regularly share their feedback with organizations. And that might be product reviews on Amazon, or it might be ratings on TripAdvisor, or it could be a whole host of things. Just the concept of sharing, from even things as diverse as Uber now with taxi, it's a core part of what we do. And everyone's prepared to talk. So there's great news for organizations, in that it just means the challenge is how you adapt to that, how you put in place the mechanisms for doing it. And the key thing is it has to become two-way feedback. It has to become dialogue. We do a lot of discussions around moving from a sort of monologue, one-off questioning into a two-way dialogue. And a key part of it, though, is the timing of this changes. It's a real realization that you have to have. And I like this quote from Peter Cheese about how you develop a feedback culture and daily conversations and how you have to do it. And it's about timing. You can't wait. It's not something that you can run on a schedule that's determined by the organization, whether that's annually or quarterly or whatever it might be. It's a real step change that you have to go through in order to embrace people's feedback and actually start to use it within the business on an ongoing basis. So there is, as I said, a bit of a step change to go through, and I think it's quite useful to refer to things like maturity models as part of this. I'm a big fan of these kinds of approaches. They can be simplistic, but they really help to position where you are as an organization. And these are the 4 stages that we see companies going through or organizations going through as they mature in their use of employee insight. And obviously, as you might expect, it starts very tactical, a single survey, somebody saying, hey, it would be a good idea to ask what happened there or what people thought. And that moves to response-driven, which I think is where most organizations are today. So it becomes, to a certain extent, event-driven. You might be doing leaver surveys or joiner surveys or something like that, collecting data at these various touch points. There's some degree of personalization to it, perhaps asking different questions to different groups, and there's some form of follow-up established. But the big step is going from that employee engagement into employee mobilization, where it becomes much more insight-driven. And I'll talk about some of the trends around that in a minute, but it's about much more moving this from being a one-off exercise into being part of business process. It's about moving to that dialogue approach that I mentioned before and looking at it continuously and in real time to get that understanding of what's going on and pulling together all of the different kind of insight points you have that you generate over time as you work, as you talk to your employees. And then the final stage, and there's not many organizations here, we probably have 1 or 2 of our customers who are foresight driven. So they actually have done the modeling and the causality and the predictive analytics to go from the fact drive engagement all the way through to business outcomes, whether it's sales or customer retention, productivity, these kinds of things. So when the leadership are making decisions about what to do in the business, strategic or operational decisions, they can have a pretty good feel for what the impact is going to be across the workforce and how they'll react and what any issues may be and how that will affect performance of the business. I think for today, most companies are trying to move from response-driven to insight-driven, and that's what I'm going to focus on. So in this next slide, I think there's 6 key themes, and we've distilled these down from all of those organizations that I mentioned before and a bunch more as well. And I'm going to give you a map in a second that kind of brings this together into a picture. But just by way of text, there's really these areas here. So the first is what you might call employee journey or employee life cycle. It's this idea of integrating all of the various touch points that you have. So you see the trend over the period of time that you have an employee within the organization, right from when they start all the way through their development, and you can link up all of those points. The second one is this implementation of always-on feedback, so making it initiated by the employee rather than having to wait to be asked, so that people can shout out, they can say what they think within a community environment perhaps, but they don't have to wait to be asked. The third one is closer ties with line of business. So this is really, examples of this within retail are something like a store format change or a new product rollout. And the line of business owner for that wants to get feedback immediately from the people who are at the coalface on that. So the people who worked in the new store on the day or the week of the rollout of that new format, how was it? What did you think? How did customers react? Being able to plug into that kind of information very quickly is a growing trend, and that's great news for people involved in HR or engagement or internal comms because it brings you closer to the business. It's a real opportunity to develop those links. And then moving on to the other 3, we have links to business outcomes. This is a big step as well, starting to talk about productivity or retention or revenue as outcomes rather than notional scores, and similarly linking to voice of customer metrics and insights. It tends to be that voice of customer is probably a couple of years ahead, if not more, in many organizations than employee insight, but there's a lot of good data to link to there. And the bottom point is kind of a summary, really. It's about moving from a series of projects into making this embedded in the business process. And just to give you a graphical map of that, If you read this from the bottom up, it kind of makes sense. The data integration layer, because we're going to integrate to business outcomes, you have to be able to have some kind of plug-in to HR systems, finance, CRM, ERP, this kind of the enterprise data network. And then within that, once you've got that foundation, you can build the employer branding and the employer value proposition. So you'll see a kind of modular approach there, from talent pool attraction, talking to people through the interview process, and then as they join the business, getting feedback from them and their ideas, and measuring engagement as they go through recruitment, onboarding, and that iterative cycle of retention and development, and ultimately into the exit stage and alumni, where some of the smarter or more innovative organizations are really using insight within the alumni community as well. And once that modular approach has been adopted, you can really interrogate it or use it in three ways, which are the three triangles. But there's still definitely a role for scheduled surveys, whether they're annual or quarterly pulse, but they're a good kind of benchmark. We're actually finding that organizations are doing it on a much more granular basis, though. So one of the leading banks has now dropped the annual survey and does a sample of people every week. So you have that constant temperature check or vital signs of the scheduled survey, rather than trying to pin it to certain points in time. And I think that's a great approach to that will widely adopt. The ad hoc questions I talked about, the line of business examples, so a new product, a new branch, a new store format, a new business process, and also that being used in change management initiatives. So say you're rolling out a new system, or it's following a reorganization or something like that, understanding what the impact is on people, which groups or which teams are developing well, which ones have got problems, and so on. And then the final triangle, and this one that can be hardest to adopt, is the always on approach, the shout out, as RSA call it, or perhaps the quite well publicized exchange initiative at HSBC, where it's in the employee's hands what they say and when they say it. So as you get all of that together, the top layer is really what makes it work, in that there's some ability to pull dashboards and analytics out of this, and ultimately to take action off the back of this, so to drive it into decision making and action planning. Okay, good. I
think that's to us.
Is that? I've just
our
seen
line has gone dead. Christina, can you call us on?
Okay, we're just reading a note here. I'm not sure if we're still live on the feed. We'll perhaps do a check on that, but there's a note from the chairperson to say that the line's not working. So I'm unsure whether everyone can hear me or not. We're just going to do a check out the back. So I'm going to.
You are live still.
Hey,
Thank you very much, Heidi.
Heidi and Rebecca.
And Rebecca.
We really appreciate your help, Heidi and Rebecca. And Joe too. Thank you, guys. There's apparently been a storm in another area with one of the presenters, which has cut us off. But we're glad to know that you're all still live and we haven't been talking to the ether for the last 10 minutes. So thank you. Okay, so hopefully that map was useful. I just want to pull out some challenges, because this isn't, it's perfectly doable. Plenty of organisations have made this kind of change and see the benefits in terms of business performance, competitiveness, and so on. There's lots of examples of that. One of my favourites is Bank of Austria, who actually used this approach post-financial crash to restructure the bank. They actually closed a third of the branch network and completely redesigned it, but improved customer satisfaction and employee satisfaction whilst they did it through doing this kind of listening process. But there are challenges. One of these top ones, and I've seen this raised in the questions on the side, is this movement from anonymous to confidential. That the real power of the data, as you saw in the map before, is integrating it, and you can't integrate it if it's completely anonymous and you don't know who it's come from. So there has to be, to get real value out of this, a move from out-and-out anonymity into confidentiality. And that's an important distinction. It still means the data is confidential and people can select when they submit the data that it's not tied back to them within the reporting and it's not visible to others. But ultimately within the system itself, it has to know who's saying what and what department they're in order to be able to drive out the real value of the trend data from there. So that's often a cultural challenge, and there's a number of steps you can take along the way to do it, but I think there needs to be a recognition of the value and the cultural value of doing that. Secondly is this breaking of the dependence on benchmarks and score targets. They're great and they're very appealing in the boardroom, benchmarks and engagement scores and so on, but ultimately they're not business outcomes, and what matters is business outcomes. And if you get wedded to these things as targets, then it defeats the object, because as a result of the process you'll say it's great, we moved up 1 point in the league table, or we moved up 1% on an engagement score. Kind of so what? Unless you're driving actual change in the business, you're not getting value from these kinds of exercises, and that's a tough realization for some organizations to make. So just finally, the last two, support for line managers. These are the guys, when you turn this into a process, who really drive the change, and you have to support them. They have to give them ways of bringing employee insight into day-to-day decision making, into doing action planning. And there's a need to recognize they need support to do that. And there's tools for achieving that, such as communities. And the final point, there is a new technology requirement. Challenges for data collection. Andrew talked about mobility and mobile devices. That's a good example there. Analysis, there's a lot of qualitative data comes out of these kinds of approaches. So text analytics, sentiment analytics. And finally, the visualization. You've been really strong on dashboarding and data visualization are important. But it's all possible. It can all be done. So that was all I wanted to say by way of approach. I think Luke's going to give us a couple of examples of technology now. Final word, just to say there's lots of content out there. And you can, if you trawl around, you look at the blogs and articles that are out there on how these things work and integrating engagement, there's lots of good things that you can read about. So I'm going to pass on to Luke.
Did you do your survey results?
Oh, I didn't do my survey results. I do apologise, Luke. I got caught up in the storm excitement and lost my so let's just have a quick look at the cultural process. What do we think? Let's have a look. Both a process and a culture. That's interesting. I think there's 50% of people who that's kind of the right answer, I think, so that's great. The issue here is a process or culture, ratio of 4 to 1, and that's kind of indicative of the change that we need to make, I think, to be able to move it along from embedded in the business really does need to become cultural. So that's interesting. Thanks for your contributions, everyone, on that. Right, I'm going to
do a scroll bar at the bottom.
Quickly scroll along to Luke's section and let it in there. Okay.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Paul. Okay, let's try not to make the screen disappear. Right, so I mean, I think we've heard really good arguments for why things need to change, and everyone I speak to, all the customers I speak to, have the same opinion. I think this change is long overdue, and I think it's taking a while, I think, some people to adopt that. And one of the things that's always going to hold people back from making a wholesale change like this is obviously the technology side of things. So we need to provide enablers for people to do this easily and effectively. I'm going to do a quick survey, as is the trend here. So in 5 years' time, I envisage our employee research to, and this is a multi-choice, so you can choose multiple answers, do pretty much what it does now. Use tools to support dialogue, link employee and customer metrics, align content closely to strategy, and utilize mobile technology. I'm expecting maybe some people are just going to tick everything, bar maybe the first one. I hope not too many people choose the first one, but I don't want to introduce bias into the survey because that's a bad thing. So I'm going to let that run for a little bit, maybe get a few more results, and then we'll move on to the next bit. while I do that, just a quick note. There was actually a question in the comments box on the left from Jacqueline Mitchell, who asked what the evidence for millennials wanting to give feedback 4 times a week was, and I think Andrew, that came from the Deloitte HCI conference in July 2014.
That's the one. As I was saying it, I was struggling to remember.
I found it while I saw the question came up. I was searching for the results, so there was some stats there to back it up. It's an interesting debate about millennials and whether or not they do exist and are a completely different species to the rest of us humans. I'm a year off being a millennial, so it's a hot topic for me. And I think in the last personnel webinar that I was presenting on back in October last year, I presented a concept from a guy called Ray Wang, who's one of my favorite public speakers in the US, who very, very eloquently stated that the millennials argument was kind of a bit misleading, and what we're actually dealing with is different stages of digital engagement, and some people who are digitally switched off and some people who are digitally switched on, which all harks back to my favorite quote from Douglas Adams, which is anything that's in the world when you're born is not ordinary. It's just a part of the way the world works. Anything that's invented between when you're 15 and 35 is new and exciting and revolutionary, and you can probably get a career in it. And anything invented after you're 35 is against the natural order of things, and so should be avoided at all costs. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about that now, so maybe this will resonate to some of you. But you know, you can maybe search for that webinar in Personnel Today's archive if you want to get an expanded view on that. Right, so I'm going to move on now. We'll come back to those results later. So I'm going to show you something here. I mean, you can see some screenshots up. What we're trying to do with technology now is go towards a mobile-first approach where everything is on a mobile device. Now, obviously, that's very much in the now. We know that people, about 40% of the population, approach their mobile device as the device of choice when going online. It's the first thing you do. And then what you tend to do is you go to your mobile device, try and do something, and when it doesn't work, you go to a laptop. And what you'll see here is that as time goes by, this rise is exponential. Year on year, we're seeing the adoption of mobile devices, the device of choice to go to the internet, is going upwards quite dramatically. So I think the last time I looked at these stats, it was something like 30%, and it went up to 40%. And we can see the adoption of feedback surveys, and this is for things like voice of the customer, etc. as well, matches that adoption curve too. So we can see that people are really just going to their mobile device to do everything that they used to do on a laptop. And when it doesn't work particularly well, they might go to the laptop. And so this is something that we really need to factor in. If we don't have something that works straight away when you go to it on your mobile phone, then obviously you're not going to get their feelings and their sentiments at that exact point in time. The other thing that we're seeing is in the move away from maybe the big annual engagement survey, where, to be fair, and I think Andrew spoke quite well to that topic, I think a lot of companies effectively pay lip service to what is engagement. You know, how am I engaging with my employees? Are they engaged employees? Well, if you ask them once a year, that's like going to hospital once a year and getting a machine attached to you and then saying that for the rest of the year you'll be absolutely fine. And so what we're seeing is yes, the rise of pulse surveys, which is really good, but also the rise of surveys where it's not the company asking you what you think, but it's you simply telling the company what you think as and when it's suitable to you, and whenever you feel you want to do it. So it might be, you know, you've just had an interaction with a colleague, maybe you've just spoken to a customer, and you might go in and just give feedback. And this is something you're going to do whenever you feel like doing it. And again, this goes back to Paul's survey question, which was, is giving feedback a process or is it a culture? And really it needs to be both. There needs to be a process, but also it needs to be a deeply cultural thing. You know, why am I giving feedback? Do I want things to be better? Do I want to create a better working environment for my colleagues and myself? So what we've got here is an example of just one of the ways in which we can tap into this, let's say, new generation of feedback givers, people who want to go to their mobile device and give feedback whenever they want. They don't necessarily want to wait for those to be asked what their opinion is. So this app, which we call MySay, that you're seeing on your screens now, is an app that everybody has access to in the entire company. and they just go in and give their feedback whenever they want. And you'll see there's a see results button, because the second big trend that we're seeing here as well is the ability to just see the results. You know, in the big annual engagement survey, you may provide all of your feedback, and then you may get the results a month later, 2 months later, sometimes never. And and then based on those results, do what? Whereas what we're seeing now is a trend where people are saying, well, okay, I did the annual engagement survey. We've done that for maybe 3, 4, 5 years. We can see maybe a little upsurge in engagement. But when people don't see the results of the survey they've taken part in, and when they can't see positive action based on those results, then maybe the next time they're asked, they might be a little bit disenfranchised. They might be not so keen to give the feedback in the first place. And so that's really speaks to the fundamental problem with feedback in general, whether it's consumer feedback or employee feedback, which is people are becoming a little bit fatigued and tired of giving feedback and doing surveys. So we really need to fix that problem, and this is one of the ways in which we can do it. Now, obviously, this might seem like a pretty straightforward thing now. Maybe I can get a survey that fits well on a mobile screen. That's fantastic. But you know, we're looking at mobile screens right now. How long will it be before the mobile is basically a hub that sits inside your pocket or your bag, and actually the device that you need to give feedback on is sitting on your wrist? And you're giving feedback on a device which doesn't have a massive screen. How on earth are you going to fit a survey designed for your PC screen or your laptop screen onto a screen the size of a 50p coin? And this really doesn't just change the way in which you display it. Okay, so you get every single question type and make it fit on a small screen. It changes the way in which you need to ask the questions. Can you imagine doing 50 questions with a rating from 1 to 5 or 1 to 6 on a screen the size of a 50p coin? You would be so annoyed after a while, and halfway through someone would call you. So basically that's not going to work anymore. So that's why we need to design these technologies to suit the people of today. What was the app name again? Thank you, Lisa, for allowing me to name drop it twice. The app name is MySay. Okay, so it's not available on the App Store, by the way, right now, so don't rush off and get it, although, you know, please do send us an email if you're interested. Okay, so really the next trend that we're seeing, and again, Paul mentioned this as well, is not the fact that when I took this screenshot I was using Internet Explorer. That's me just bucking a trend, really. It's the fact that we're looking at real-time visualizations, insights for pretty much everyone in the company, which you can see real trends in what's going on, and you can see the actions, you can see what's happening, and also when you give your feedback, you can see how that actually affects the feedback that you see in the visualization. You're not looking at a report that was delivered 2 months later. Now what we can see here is something we're referring to as mobilization. So we've kind of seen, you know, employee satisfaction, we've seen employee engagement, and now we're looking at, okay, so we've got all these engaged employees, and I really want to tap into all that energy and that drive and that ambition, and I want to make sure that it's going somewhere productive. And that really is a function of not just how engaged my employees are, because they could all be giving like 50% more than, you know, their day-to-day job normally demands. But do we have the right processes in place? Do we have the right offering? Are the market and competition in the right place for us to succeed? And really when we take all of those things together and create a function of that, then we get the mobilization score. What's our ability to really take the business forwards? And there was a question earlier, I can't remember who it was from, so apologies for forgetting your name, but there was a question, you know, what's the model for small businesses? I think this is the model for small businesses and large businesses. The difference is, can you take this model and actually deploy it to an extremely large business? My argument is yes, absolutely, and we can certainly see companies wanting to do that. Okay, so I'm not going to bore you with too much more. I'm going to show you another shot of a visualization, again just showing how you need to try and build in maybe some of the qualitative and quantitative here as well, so you get the live comments, the ability to click on comments and actually react to those. So for instance, if somebody says, and this is part of the culture of feedback as well, I think Andrew mentioned it earlier, or was it Paul, about the move from anonymous to confidential. Once you start asking people what they think, and you start getting a lot of qualitative information, then actually your ability to be perfectly anonymous, if you're giving the results to everybody, is reduced. So what we need to do here is work on maybe the most important part of giving feedback, which is the art of receiving feedback. And what we can do here is if everyone can see what everyone thinks, and somebody says, I think our ability to deliver the company message is atrocious, then we should be able to go back to that individual and say, okay, fantastic. what should we do about it, and let's put an action plan in place and let's improve it. So the next time we measure that, we've actually seen some improvement. Right, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to just quickly run back to the survey. And as expected, I think we're seeing quite an even spread of technologies and tools here. A link to employee and customer metrics, I think that's a really strong one. I think that also allows us to start building maybe some of the business cases behind engagement. Aligning content closely to strategy, absolutely, and that's part of having a culture and becoming a mobilized organization. And using mobile technology, which is just an absolute must, as you've seen from some of the things I've shown you. So again, apologies if I've missed some of the questions on the left, but I think we've reached the last slide.
And from my perspective, I'm very glad that only 5.6% of people said they wanted to continue doing what they are.
Yeah, I didn't really speak to that, but that's absolutely true. It's nice to know.
But I think it's also interesting that you got the highest response on that survey was aligned closely with strategy. And if you go back to the first poll we did, which showed that a lot of people, 45, I think, are still being steered in the question and the approach by external methodologies from third parties, there's to be a big change, because if you want to align to your strategy, it is your strategy, and the questions and the approach have to reflect your business, not an external benchmark or a third-party IP. So I think it's
absolutely
some symmetry there.
Yeah, absolutely. And a final note on benchmarking, while I've got 30 seconds. If you're benchmarking against another company that's doing pretty much the same as you in the industry, then I guess that's absolutely fine. But what better place to benchmark than how you did last week? And if you're trying to tap into what employees think about an organisation, and if you can start to map a trend, if you're collecting the feedback often enough, and it's a voluntary feedback, then actually you start to map a much more interesting trend. So anyway, that's my last word. I'll pass over to you, Rob.
Thank you, gents. It was all very interesting. Apologies for I think you'll be pleased to hear that you missed the thunder and the hailstones on the window at this end. But we were offline for 5 or 10 minutes, I'm afraid. But we caught most of it, and so thank you for a very interesting presentation. We've got a few more questions from the audience that I've picked up. One fairly early on, and I guess this comes up quite a bit with employee surveys. Sarah asks, what about requests from employees for surveys to be anonymous? So does anonymity change as we move forward with this type of thing? Sometimes you get a very cynical approach from particularly sort of unionised workplaces. Any comments from any of you?
Yeah, I think it's a reality you have to recognise, and I have heard an example quite recently of a union in the public sector advising its members not to contribute to any form of public sector engagement survey or feedback because it will be used against you in evidence. And so it's a real shame, and I'm sure, and I really hope as we progress and mature that culturally we'll get over that. But you do have to recognise it's still a factor. I would really advocate and encourage businesses to move towards confidentiality rather than anonymity. But it can be a gradual step-by-step change. So quite often we'll see systems where there is an option up front about do you wish to give anonymous feedback or confidential feedback, and going down two different routes depending on which people want to do. And I think the final point for me is you have to always have some kind of safety valve of anonymity, so kind of whistleblowing or reporting inappropriate behaviour, that kind of thing. So it's perfectly possible and sensible and right to have a kind of separate mechanism for reporting that kind of inappropriate action or behaviour.
Okay.
Go ahead. I often think that you can send out mixed messages when you major on anonymity in surveys, because a lot of organisations are saying they want to encourage an open feedback of culture and trust where people can, contribute their views openly. But then having an anonymous survey reinforces the message that we realise that you think we can't be trusted. So I do think there's a mixed message there, and I think that's one of the fundamental questions that organisations need to ask themselves, are we in that position whereby we can move on from there?
Okay. Another good question from Jacqueline. I think she asked one earlier as well. The ability to speed up feedback and get instant results might be increasing, but business change often happens more slowly. How can business speed up change if they speed up the way they gather feedback? I mean, is it sometimes a bit frustrating to get this feedback and then, you know, the usual slow cogs of large organisations fail to help you move?
Yeah, so I think there's two sides to this in answering this question. The technology can help because we can provide obviously visualizations that allow it to give you real-time or near real-time results on what people have asked, and I think that helps to get people to give more feedback, and that helps to shift the culture a little bit. I think fundamentally, though, in order to do this, it needs to be driven from the top. I think the best organizations are the ones where the CEO is leading that culture change. So I think if you can drive that, then that's the best thing. I think what we like to see is an organization where they're willing to open a feedback center of excellence, where actually they understand the role of feedback in the wider business context. And I think when you start to see that driven from the top down as a message and used from the top down, then you start to see people willing to engage from the bottom up, because they can actually see that this is the change that's likely to lead somewhere. I think simply giving people a soapbox to stand on isn't necessarily productive in an environment where they don't feel they're being listened to. So that's the really important thing. It's not so much the technology, which it is absolutely the technology, but it's making sure that the organization is ready for the change and willing to make it. And I think that's something where we've got quite a bit of experience now in helping companies to adopt those practices.
But I've seen some good examples of this kind of feedback approach actually speeding up decision making. I mentioned the HSBC exchange program before, which is kind of an always-on approach, and they're driving really simple decisions. You know, even small stuff about where the printers are and how we have sort of facility processes or canteens operate. It's quite small things, but actually which do make a difference to people, and the ability to have those decisions made very quickly at a line management level based on the real-time feedback that you get from people. So you can make a big difference by the sum of a large number of small actions. I think that can work effectively in this feedback approach. Okay.
Great. Okay. Now I'm going to combine three questions into one here. Mario, Danielle, and Christina all essentially asked, who are the top companies in this? Who is doing engagement well? Who is using employee feedback to the best results? Could you give us some examples quickly?
Yeah, I can. I don't think anyone's got all the answers, but there's certainly good examples of best practice around. I mentioned HSBC already, and they're doing some great work. I think within financial services, Royal Sun Alliance, RSA, with the More Than insurance brand, they took a big step forward in this last year with a program called Your Say, which is quite well published. In fact, we did a webinar with Personnel Today on this last year. So I think there's some great examples in there of how they've used Always On through a program of allowing shout-outs and shout-ups for managers to escalate feedback, and lots of use of town halls and really taking that into the business. So that's a good example. There are some good retail examples around. I think I've seen a statement from Sainsbury's where they have a real commitment to have, and I think the way they phrase it is to understand their colleagues as well as they understand their customers, which I think is a really fantastic way of encapsulating this and closing that gap between customer experience and the investment in that and what's happened with employees. And I know they do a lot of good work, and it's a real regular topic at the boardroom is customer voice. So those would be some examples from me.
I think it's probably worth drawing attention to First Direct within the HSBC group. I think what they're doing, particularly around the customer voice of the customer and customer engagement piece, is particularly for the sector very advanced. And also within the retail sector, there are organisations like Iceland, for example, who have brought engagement very much into all of their HR practices, their recruitment and their performance management, and that I think is quite cutting edge.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for those examples. We have just past 3 o'clock, so unfortunately that is all we have time for. As you, the audience, log out, please fill in our exit survey, and you'll also be able to download a Questback white paper on this topic. Today's webinar is available on demand soon, and you'll be able to share that with colleagues, and you'll also be able to find the webinar that we did with Questback back in October. If you go to personneltoday.com/webinars, it's there with an archive of around 40 other webinars that you could watch. Okay, it just leaves me to thank our guests, Andrew Cox, Paul Barnes and Luke Talbot from Questback. And thank you all for your time today. You've been listening to a Personnel Today webinar in association with Questback. Thanks for joining us, and goodbye.